Hello my fellow armourers and welcome back to the Iron Crown Workshop. Today we're exploring another essential key skill in the craft of making armour. Today's hack, pattern making. We're going to look at what are the tools required for an armourer to develop patterns, and later on in the video we're going to be tackling the mentality it takes to take these original artifacts and turn them into a design that we can then reproduce in steel. If you want to support us further and potentially see some of these patterns a little bit closer up, please follow us over on Patreon. The link's in the description below. Without further ado, let's get into the process. Patterning is the skill that allows us to reliably reproduce the shape that we see in original armour. It allows us also to capture the lessons and mistakes that we make in previous projects and store them in a way that we can refer back to at a later date. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, patterning is an essential skill to learn and understand more about armour and to grow in our ability to reproduce pieces from history. Voila, my friends, the tools of the trade. Now, before I get started, I should probably say that patterning is not a skill that I am an expert in yet. I've done a lot of patterning, but in my apprenticeship learning under Luke at Red Heart, I've often used pre-existing patterns to work from, adapt, resize, or learn from. This pattern, in fact, that you can see right here is the first time I've actually developed a pattern for a gauntlet, at least, from scratch, from the very beginning, and there's still a lot of lessons to learn. Now, there's some fantastic armourers out there that are absolute gods of patterning, like Robert McPherson. You can actually find some of his brilliant work on the United League of Armourers, a Facebook page dedicated entirely to the craft of arms and armour. Besides having to learn a lot of lessons in patterning, there's some fundamental tools and skills that are required no matter where you are on the journey. So let's kick off. Let's get started by talking about materials. I like to use these manila folder cardstock that I find at my local office supplies. I like them because I have this central crease here that's really good for capturing and working off the axis of symmetry in the armor. You could use a lot of different things for patterning stock, but as long as it's some kind of card material, it should work pretty well. Draft paper, design, pattern making paper in general is also a good fit. You can usually find that at art supply stores as well. Now for the tools. Well, obviously when you're starting to make a pattern, you need measurements to work from. To get those, you're going to want to use things like this tape measure for taking distance either linearly or around circumferences. Rulers are also another fantastic tool when it comes to measuring and drawing up the lines of symmetry in your piece. Another great tool in the armourer's toolbox are calipers. Calipers allow us to take distances across certain parts of the body, or dividers, which allow us to take distance measurements and then transfer them either to the pattern material or to find that measurement using the rulers. Obviously, you'll need scissors for cutting out your patterns, and pencils and erasers as well as Sharpies are a fantastic set of tools for doing all the drawing that you require. Pencil comes in handy for being able to erase lines because in armouring you're going to be drawing a lot of lines, and oftentimes there's just an absolute soup of lines going in all directions, and it comes in handy when you can rub those out as opposed to trying to pick between 5 different lines to make a cut. When you got to actually cut out your pattern, a really cool hack is to fold that pattern in half. This is how you get symmetry in your pattern, because for most of us, reliably replicating what we've done on one side of a pattern to the other is very difficult. But there's a little hack with that. When you go to cut out that pattern, trace the design for your piece on one side, cut it out first, then fold it over and retrace that before cutting it out. Simply folding it in half and cutting it, while it's quicker, can often lead to misalignment as the paper can often move along that center line. One of the things you have to do when you're patterning is actually combine pieces together, kind of like this gauntlet that we have here made from multiple different pieces. One of the tools that I love a lot is masking tape. This little buddy helps us to stick on extra material to our pattern if we need it, or to adjust our pattern if we need to cut slits in it, remove material and then rejoin it together when we need to capture some of the angles that we require in the pieces. Great hack. Another really important thing when joining pieces together are rivets. Now, obviously we can't pin rivets into the paper. So instead, one of the things that's very useful are these split pins. We simply create holes in our pattern, and then using the split pins, we can join pieces together to see how they articulate and what the distances are between the holes. To create the holes, I often use a rotary punch like this. This is a tool used for punching holes in leather, but works for the paper just as well. Now, when sketching out lines for patterns, it can be quite difficult to get the beautiful flowing curves that you see in a finished pattern just by hand. In fact, for myself, that never works. So using freehand, you can get your general curves in place, but the absolute bee's knees of patterning is the French curve ruler. Ooh, yes. It can be found at sewing supply stores and dressmaking suppliers, and it offers an unlimited continuous curve that can be used to match any transition and any shape that's required. This is particularly useful when blending between areas where the curve changes in shape and we want to get these beautiful flowing Gothic arch shapes in our armor. That flow and symmetry is super important in patterning, and this tool is the hack that makes it possible. I often also like to use coins of different sizes, such as these, to get those tighter radii, just as a guide to help things come along smoothly and consistently. Another tool that's helpful when actually making patterns is an angled ruler, or something like this. It enables us to actually capture the angle, say for example, of a fold to a breastplate, or a piece like this manifold where we want to be able to see what the angle that we have in the piece actually is. Because matching those angles is essential for the function of the armor and a really important thing to have on hand. Measurements are super critical to any design. And for example, in the gauntlet build that we're doing here on the channel, I had to take a whole range of measurements across my hand, around my hand, and in all kinds of dimensions when I was actually creating this pattern. Speaking of measurements, let's talk a little bit more about the mentality it takes for us to actually go about the craft of patterning. A key tip to remember when you're taking your measurements is to take those measurements over what it is you're going to be wearing underneath. In the case of the gauntlet, I want to be taking those measurements over this glove that I'm wearing right now. If you don't take those measurements over what you're going to be wearing underneath, you can get to the end of your project and it's going to end up being too small, which is a huge disappointment after you've spent hundreds, maybe thousands of hours working on something just for it to not fit in the final analysis. Another really cool tip to remember when you're patterning is to remember to add extra for roll material. It's always better to have a little bit extra than a bit less, because you can't add more material onto the armor, but you can certainly trim material away. Those trimmings can come in handy for adjusting your pattern down the track. But it's a big disappointment if you've made a beautiful piece and then find that you don't have enough material left to put the roll on it. It changes the entire proportions, and it's a real letdown, especially when you put all that effort into making it look beautiful. Now we've looked at the tools of the trade, let's talk about the mentality. How is it that we can think about going from this image of armor from a museum somewhere across the world and turning that into a medieval blueprint that we can actually work from to make some steel? Well guys, it all starts with measurements. Measurements of the functional parts of the body. We need to know the distance, for example, for our gauntlet between the wrists and the knuckles, and then the wrist and where we want the gauntlet to stop. Those kind of measurements are super key to getting the armor to function, which is what it's all about in the end. Taking those measurements, we can then create a pattern working along the axial lines of the piece. With those measurements and the axial lines, the rest of pattern making is primarily blending between those lines of axis of symmetry and just ensuring we have enough material left over to do the shaping we need. One thing that's super interesting is that for a lot of the deeper shapes in armor, a lot of that design work and understanding goes into the shaping itself. And so for pieces like a manifold or a helmet, where we're sinking a lot of shape, we actually need to do the work in the steel first before we have a real idea of what the pattern is going to be. Oftentimes, this results in a back and forth between these two mentalities of patterning and armoring, and we can learn from those two processes with the trimmings of the pieces that we create, which can then be transferred across to the paper to create more complex patterns. The way that I'd approach something that's an immense challenge, like how are you going to create this complex gauntlet or whatever it is that you're making, is start with those measurements, find those axes of symmetry, and then just kind of estimate what you think the pattern should be. You're probably gonna get it wrong, guys. It's like when you're learning to make armor, which is something that was learned over decades, hundreds of years by the time it was at its peak in the 15th century. Those guys are working off patterns from masters going back to the antiquity and the beginning of time. So don't stress your little head over the fact that you don't understand what you're doing. Just make a guess and get started in steel. There's been a few times where I've worked on a piece for maybe a week, getting it beautiful and refined, and then just to realize I don't have enough material left to put a roll on the piece, or not enough material left to get the exact shape. And that's pretty disheartening when you've worked so hard to try and match an original piece. So just add on extra material, guys. You can always take that away. And here's the good part, what you trim off your piece, you can then transfer to the pattern that you just made, and with each and every iteration, you can refine that into something better and better. It's this back and forwards between using the pattern and shaping the steel and then transferring that information back to the paper that allows us to reliably recreate the armor that we're making and learn from the process. Over time, developing more complex and more refined patterns from that back and forwards process. Ultimately, in the end, you'll end up with a pattern with holes, flutes marked on it, sometimes even little instructions for things that you need to do next time. And that's why keeping a good record system of the patterns that you use is really essential to growing your understanding of armoring and giving yourself that little hand up next time you come back to a similar project. Sometimes the process of taking a pattern from scratch, like we did with the Gauntlet, can be incredibly tedious, working between pattern after pattern after pattern, just trying to get it right before you start on the process. But patterning is a powerful tool, guys, because it lets us master steel and handle incredibly complex information in a way that would otherwise not be possible. I know a few times in the workshop when I've been making armor, knowing that I can use paper and pencil and craft something, particularly in something like a cuirass, with each and every lame of that fold, that I'm able to actually use the skill of patterning and working in steel to test and design armor from my mind into real life, just based off measurements and proportions. And when you get to that place, that is a very powerful feeling, to have control over this complex medium of steel and match that to the human body, drawing upon all of those skills, is a real gift. It's this complexity and information that is stored in patterns, which is why professional and experienced armorers' patterns are so expensive and rare. See, to create these patterns, there's tens of thousands of hours of experience, trial, error, mistakes, victories contained in the patterns that they have in their workshops. But ultimately, to unlock those patterns, you require the skills and the experience to understand how that pattern works. Utilizing the two mentalities that we talked about earlier, between the sculpting mentality, creating the shape in the steel, and the patterning approach, there's a blend between what techniques we use to create the piece and the pattern itself. And it's due to this process that most of the patterns that you get access to have a unique set of skills associated with them in order to get the outcome that that armorer has achieved. Now, to add to that, a suit of armor has many different pieces, and the challenge of fitting steel to the human body is different for the hands to the sculpture of the greave, which has to fit the human leg absolutely perfectly to get a skin-tight fit, versus a cuirass or a helmet. Each pattern requires a whole different approach to how it's shaped and to how much work is put into achieving it. Some are quite simple, like lames, some are incredibly complex, like greaves and helmets. So it's the skill of patterning that becomes an absolute superpower here for the aspiring armorer and the expert armorer, since it allows us to adjust existing patterns or develop new ones from scratch that both fit the human anatomy and reflect the historical originals as they were. It's the skill of patterning that lets us adapt our craft across the entire human anatomy and allows us to capture reliably and for later use the shapes that we've come to understand from original artifacts and to share that with other people. Other armorers' patterns are a great reference point to start from on your journey of understanding the process of armoring. However, The patterning process and the tips and tricks we've talked about today will let you adapt those patterns to your own unique approach to armoring as you learn the ins and outs and the curves of historical artifacts. Here at Iron Crown Workshop, we want to help aspiring armorers with both wings of this approach, both with the video content we produce here on the channel, showcasing and unlocking the mysteries of the armoring process, but also the patterns to what we produce here on the channel, which you can access on our Patreon for a limited time. If you guys are enjoying the content that we're producing here at Iron Crown Workshop, like this video here on patterning, then please get behind our team and support us by following us on Patreon. We want to release and share the resources behind some of the work that we do here, and more than anything, it would be great to have your support so we can continue to create these videos at the highest level of quality possible. We're here to encourage, fan the flames, and build a community of like-minded people around the ideas of arms, armor, and the history of this ancient craft. And we want to give you guys the tools and the passion from here in the workshop to pursue that. For now, Iron Crown signing off.